You are listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 25th of February 2025 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, broadcasting live from Studio One here at Midori House in London. I'm Chris Chermak. Coming up on today's program, can a Syrian National Dialogue Conference usher in a new era of inclusivity for a nation that long lived under dictatorship? After that,
we're talking about a tariff of 10% on China based on the fact that they're sending fentanyl to Mexico and Canada.
We look at the truth behind China's role in the illicit fentanyl trade through Mexico. We get an update on Ukraine, and then we'll hear about the candidates hoping to become Canada's next Prime Minister.
I think it's difficult to overstate just how deeply Donald Trump's manoeuvres against Canada's economy have given the candidates vying for the leadership of the Liberal Party a dominant theme.
Finally, a look into the growing and lucrative relationship between the worlds of fashion and Formula One. All that right here on The Briefing with me, Chris Chermak. Ever since Syria toppled its longtime authoritarian leader Bashar al-Assad, the question has been what comes next, and whether any future government, lasting government, will be democratic and inclusive. Today marks the first real test of that new Syrian plurality as the country's interim government plans to hold a national dialogue conference. Well, Hannah Lucinda Smith is Monocle's Istanbul correspondent and recently returned from Syria. She joins us now. Hannah, tell us first of all about this National Dialogue Conference. Who initiated it and what do we expect to happen?
Hi. Yeah, well, of course, it's almost 3 months since the fall of Bashar al-Assad's regime. And what came in its place so far has been something of a vacuum. There are, of course, new leaders, those being a group called Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. They came down from the north, where they'd controlled an area of Aleppo and Idlib for several years. Politically and technocratically, they'd been sort of running services there. So they do have some kind of experience, but clearly the transition from the Assad family dictatorship, which was in place, let's not forget, for 54 years, a complete grip on Syria, a complete lack of democracy, civil society, and also in the past 4 years, an almost completely closed economy as Syria first descended into civil war and then came under heavy sanctions. So the aim of this conference is to really reset Syria. What we have at the moment is a transitional government. Ahmed al-Sharaa, the leader of HTS, is a transitional president, but they need to decide on all kinds of things. What is Syria going to look like? What's its economy going to look like? Its foreign policy, and also its constitution. This is the key thing, because Syria is a really, really mixed country. It has Christians, it has different types of Sunni Muslims, it has Shia Muslims, it has a group called the Druze. And this group, which is a Sunni Muslim, quite extreme in its roots, it was a group, well, very extreme, it was linked to al-Qaeda 10 years ago, has moved away from that and is trying to show that it is going to rule Syria inclusively. So that's the key thing. People are going to be looking for signs in whatever announcement comes out about the constitution, that's going to be the case, that this is going to be a government, a transition that is for all Syrians, not just for the Sunni Muslims.
And Hannah, as you mentioned there, HTS doesn't really have experience of governing. To what extent do they recognize that, I suppose? To what extent do they recognize that they need help here, that it's not maybe just about sounding inclusive and including other groups, but that they need an entire group of people, of experts, of ministers, and input from others in Syria in order to make this work?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a recognition of that very, very genuinely, even without the need to show this in order to get the support of Western countries, principally to get sanctions lifted. We did have an announcement yesterday from the European Union that certain EU sanctions are being suspended. Those are sanctions on energy, transport and the banking system. And I think that's a really major sign of support towards Syria, a real kind of big gesture as this conference starts, because sanctions are the thing now that are crippling the country. The mood in Damascus is almost hard to over-describe how happy people are at the end of the Assad regime. This was a really monstrous regime. There's not a person in the country that's not been touched. But economically, the country is really, really struggling. And these are sanctions that were placed on Assad's regime. There's also the problem that Ahmed al-Sharaa and his group HTS are still listed in the US as a terrorist organization, even though they're now in charge of the country. But I think also, okay, they haven't run the whole of Syria, but they have run a fairly large and fairly complicated area since 2018, an area with a lot of internally displaced people, an area coming under bombardment from Assad's air forces and army. And they've managed to do that reasonably well with help from the outside, with help from humanitarian organisations, particularly countries like Turkey, which shared a border with that area, working to set up refugee camps and these kind of things. And so I think, it is not a group or a government that is entirely novice. It has some experience. And certainly now, one of the key things about sanctions being lifted is that it will open the way for Syrian companies to start trading with the world, but also for foreign companies to start trading with Syria and sending goods and expertise and services into Syria. And that's the really desperate thing that the country needs.
And Hannah, just finally, when you talk about the Constitution, tell us what that might look like. We do talk about inclusivity here, including different groups, but there is another side to that. I'm reminded perhaps of Lebanon as well, neighboring, which has, a constitution that allows so much input, so many disparate voices that it's frankly a bit dysfunctional. Is there a risk of that in Syria as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you don't need to look very far in Syria's neighbourhood to see examples of constitutions which look great on paper and don't function very well. Syria is a very, very intricate social mix. And, there is a feeling that really needs to be reflected. And, in order for the country to kind of move past this war, which was tarnished by sectarianism almost right from the start, in order to be able to live together. The fear is, and this is one of the criticisms of this conference that's happening today, on the committee, there is only one Christian, and that Christian is the only person on that committee who's not Sunni Muslim. So already there is some kind of representation issues there. Some of the early decisions given by the transitional government in areas like the education system, wanting to ramp up learning about Islam and things like that, sort of have made people a little bit nervous. But I have to say, overall, people were surprisingly optimistic about this new government, mostly because they say, listen, we have no other option. This is what we have now. They are saying the right things. So far, they're doing the right things. So we have to give them the benefit of the doubt. And, almost everyone that I spoke to in Syria, they were waiting for this conference. They see this conference and the statements that will come after it as really the kind of biggest statement so far from this new government of what direction they're going to take Syria in.
Thanks very much, Hannah. That was Hannah Lucinda Smith, Monocle's Istanbul correspondent. And now here's Laura Kramer with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Chris. The EU has offered Ukraine a natural resources deal, calling it a win-win partnership. Meanwhile, the U.S. is negotiating its own agreement, reportedly seeking $500 billion worth of Ukraine's reserves. South Korea's ousted President Yoon Suk-yeol has faced his final impeachment hearing. Judges will decide whether to remove him over his martial law declaration. Yoon has made his final defense while Parliament presented its case for his removal. And Japan's first freight-only Shinkansen bullet train will start service this autumn between Tokyo and Morioka. East Japan Railway is converting a passenger train to transport precision equipment and fresh fish. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Chris.
Thanks very much, Laura. Among the Trump administration's justifications for tariffs against both Mexico and China and Canada has been the production and trafficking of fentanyl into the United States. U.S. officials accuse China of being part of an illicit trading network, funneling supplies and laundering money for Mexican drug cartels that produce and deal the drug across the U.S. border. Fentanyl is now the leading cause of death for young people in the United States. Patricia Kausman is Europe finance reporter for The Wall Street Journal and joins us now for more on this. Patricia, thanks very much for coming on the show. Describe, first of all, how this illicit trading network operates, at least according to U.S. officials.
Sure. Thanks for having me. This is like a match made in heaven, basically. You have drug cartels that have all this money that they make from selling fentanyl and other drugs in the US that they need to clean and send back home, like in Mexico, for instance. While there are a lot of people in China who are dying to get a hold of US dollars in the US, either to make investments like, buy property or buy luxury goods or even pay for college tuition for their kids who are studying in the US. So basically what these money launderers do is that they get the cash from the Mexican cartels and sell those US dollars to these Chinese people in China, dying to get a hold of the US dollars.
A match made in heaven, as you describe it there, Patricia. Is that a match that the Chinese government accepts, understands as well, or is there more that they could be doing to try and crack down on this if they wanted to?
Yeah, it's really interesting because one of the reasons why people in China are dying to get a hold of US dollars is simply because it's really hard because there are capital controls in China that basically forbids people from buying more than $50,000 worth of foreign currency each year. That's a way to kind of like keep the money in and not flowing outside, and it keeps the Chinese currency more stable. So part of the reason why people are going underground to buy these US dollars is precisely because China doesn't like the idea of people buying US dollars. But, that said, law enforcement officials, they say that China could indeed do more to crack down on this issue. For one thing, paying more attention about the kind of flows of money that pass through China, because it's a bit more complicated than what I explained, but like ultimately, once the person in China buys the US dollar, they deposit the same amount, but in Chinese currency in a Chinese bank account that belongs to this money launderer. So it involves Chinese banks, and people say, this US law enforcement officials say involves Chinese banks, and therefore China could be doing more to be more vigilant about its banks.
And when you when you look at what China can potentially do, there are also these tariffs from the Trump administration, of course, that are coming into effect. Do you expect that might prompt a rethink, I guess, either in Mexico or China? The irony of perhaps of what you were talking about there, this idea that China actually might need to open up to US dollars in order to perhaps curb some of this. Is that something they would consider, or are there other things they would consider as well?
I mean, it's really like one thing that we must say, it's really hard to stop money laundering, right? This activity has existed since forever. And, the issue here is that, of course, pressure is on because Trump specifically has made, ending the fentanyl crisis in the US one of his main pledges. But I mean, shutting down these networks of money launderers is just, it's extremely difficult. And it's just a lot of people literally picking bags of cash in random corners in US cities and kind of disappearing with them. And we also know, and we need to be fair, like money laundering exists even in countries that have pledged to end this activity, including the US itself. I mean, how many US banks have been found not to have proper controls to prevent illicit money from flowing through them? So this is not like a Chinese problem and it's unclear, that China has 100% the will of it. We know that what China has said is that the root cause of the fentanyl crisis lies in the US itself, and that, Trump imposing tariffs just ignores a lot of the cooperation that already exists, and ultimately that blaming others for its own problems will not really solve that problem.
Patricia Kausman, you're a finance reporter for The Wall Street Journal. Thank you very much for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. You are back with The Briefing. I'm Chris Chermak. Today marks the day after the third anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And for this fourth year, the question for Kyiv is how long the war will continue. It's taken on a different character this year. The possible loss of U.S. military and financial aid could have a major impact on how Ukraine can wage an effective defense against Russia. Well, joining me now for a newspaper review from Ukraine and Russia is Julia Lasica, Monocle's writer and researcher, right here in the studio. Good afternoon, Julia.
Hi, good afternoon.
So let's look at some of these stories around this. You've been looking at a story from the Wall Street Journal, which really looks into what U.S. aid means for Ukraine.
Yeah, absolutely. So the story is really fascinating. It's quite revealing. We often think, how many of its weapons is Ukraine making itself? What's it getting from Europe? What's it getting from the US? And this reveals that Ukraine currently builds or finances about 55% of its military hardware. The US supplies around 20% and Europe supplies about 25%. And what Ukrainian media has really picked up on from this is that if the war continues at its current rate, and if all US aid stops, as many fear it might, then Ukraine can carry on until the summer. Some Ukrainian analysts are saying it can push a little bit further into the autumn at its current rate, and then its strategies will have to change.
Well, that is the question, isn't it? Is it that the war would end, or what kind of strategies, I suppose, are being considered? Is there talk of that in Ukraine in terms of how this would continue if it were to continue beyond the summer?
Yeah, I wonder. I mean, Ukraine has really put in a lot of money, a lot of thinking and a lot of investment into its own military, making its own weapons. And Europe is really feeling the impetus now to catch up. So I wonder if by the end of this year, we would start to be seeing maybe more of a shift of 90% at least, Europe and Ukraine, if things really, really speed up. But I think what's being kind of said here in this article, and what analysts have been saying generally, is that the US supplies a lot of the very sophisticated, precise weapons that are needed for particular systems. And so if those go, then Ukraine loses the ability to do, for example, long-range strikes that are made possible through US weapons.
Now, one other aspect of, in a sense, why U.S. aid is stopping is the fact that Donald Trump and the Trump administration have been speaking with Russia. They've been talking about reaching some kind of peace deal here when it comes to Ukraine. And one other aspect of that you have for us is the U.S. offering a potential new bilateral agreement with Ukraine. What would that look like?
Yeah, so this looks a little bit more interesting than the one that they were trying to slam down on Ukraine's desk before. This would give the US a co-management role over Ukraine's resources in exchange for a long-term financial commitment to rebuilding the country after the war. So this is reported by Euronews. And according to the draft that they saw, which is dated from the 21st of February, so they saw it, in the last 24 hours, but it was dated from 4 days ago. The fund will operate during the period of defending, reconstructing, and then returning Ukraine to its year-end 2021 GDP figure. The Europeans have actually, and we've been talking about this in the office, the Europeans have actually offered their own version of this, their own version, which they say is mutually beneficial and a win-win partnership where the EU and Ukraine work on their own deal of managing the country's natural resources. So I guess it's funny that we're sort of seeing a very blatant, open thing now, which is, part of the reason why Putin and Russia invaded Ukraine was for the country's natural resources. And now we're seeing the US and the EU coming out and saying, well, yeah, actually, you do have something to offer.
And interestingly, even perhaps Vladimir Putin has talked up his own country's resources and sort of mentioned that as another option for the United States. Is that a sign almost that maybe he is worried somewhat about these negotiations? Trump is transactional. If he gets the resources from Ukraine, then perhaps there are stronger security guarantees for Ukraine than one might expect.
Yeah, actually, behind the scenes, there's a lot of worry on the Russian side. Lots of Ukrainian analysts have been picking up on the fact that Putin can't take too long when it comes to this. We've seen Trump wants results as quickly as possible. That's why he's pushing Ukraine so hard. And that's actually why he's also pushing Russia really hard. So Putin can't afford to drag his feet. But of course, Putin is his own character. And if he wants to, he will drag his feet. And then we'll start to see potentially fissures in this scary new alliance that's building up.
Now, Julie, you have some other stories for us from a slightly different aspect of this war memorials that are being unveiled and kind of the role of art and monuments during this war.
Yeah, so there's this really interesting story from Rubrika, which is a Ukrainian paper. Yesterday, a new memorial to Ukrainian intelligence officers was unveiled in central Kyiv. And I just thought it was a very interesting thing. Well, firstly, it's the first part of this memorial, so it's not completely finished yet, but they unveiled it for the anniversary, and it's a very modern take on memorials. Ukraine has to battle with the Soviet heritage of enormous monuments like that we see, enormous heads of Stalin or whatever. And now they're kind of going into the more contemporary look at how do you commemorate people. Also, it's very difficult because the war is ongoing. And so memory is a very active, live, painful thing. So how do we make sure that these people who are dying around us, how do we make sure that we commemorate them, write their names, but also in a very tasteful, nice way to look at, and something that's not brutal and staring you in the face.
Do you get that sense that the discussion that's happening in Ukraine right now is very much that they want to take memorials and art in a different direction from those Soviet times?
Yes, definitely. And sometimes it doesn't really work. So there was a very harrowing case of a Ukrainian soldier who was shot on camera, executed. He was a prisoner of war on the Russian side of the front line. Anyway, but then there was this absurd statue of him that was unveiled, and it was that Cristiano Ronaldo statue that was like his bronze face, and it was sort of not very good looking at all. And it was sort of similar to that, and it was really confusing. I think people felt very upset, like that something had been done so distastefully to such an important figure in Ukrainian, modern history.
So still some debates there, in other words, in exactly how to go about this. Monocle's Julia Lassica, thank you very much for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. This is The Briefing, and to Canada next, where last night in Montreal, 4 candidates vying to replace Justin Trudeau as Prime Minister and as leader of the Liberal Party met for the first of 2 televised debates. Last night was a French-language debate, and tonight's debate is in English, which will be the last time party members get to see the candidates debate each other before they vote on the 9th of March. Monocle's correspondent in Toronto, Thomas Lewis, gives us his assessment of the Liberal Party's leadership race so far.
Well, I think we can expect that there will be one dominant theme during tonight's second and final live televised debate between the 4 remaining candidates who are vying to replace Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, both as leader of Canada's Liberal Party and as Prime Minister, and that is the relationship with the United States. Only yesterday at the White House, during his joint press conference with France's President Emmanuel Macron, President Trump was asked about whether the tariffs he announced, 25% on all imports from Canada into the US, whether they were going to go ahead as planned. They are scheduled to take effect next week on the 4th of March. And this is what he had to say.
No, the tariffs are going forward on time, on schedule. This is an abuse that took place for many, many years. And I'm not even blaming the other countries that did this. I blame our leadership for allowing it to happen. I mean, who can blame them if they made these great deals with the United States, took advantage of the United States on manufacturing, on just about everything. Every aspect that you could imagine they took advantage of. I look at some of these agreements, I'd read them at night, and I'd say, who would ever sign a thing like this? So the tariffs will go forward, yes.
I think it's difficult to overstate just how deeply and profoundly that Donald Trump's manoeuvres against Canada's economy have upended politics in Canada and have given the candidates vying for the leadership of the Liberal Party a dominant theme on which to campaign in varying degrees of detail, it's worth noting. They also pose a problem to Canada's Conservative Party under leader Pierre Poilievre. Now, the party was enjoying a 26-point lead in the opinion polls only a few weeks ago. That lead has been shrinking pretty consistently over the past few weeks since Donald Trump began his threats in earnest of tariffs against Canadian exports into the US. And when Canadians have been polled about who they think would be the best leader to negotiate with Donald Trump directly, Mark Carney comes out on top of those surveys, quite some way ahead of Pierre Poilievre himself. So I think these debates will be scrutinised pretty deeply by an electorate that feels particularly engaged in the future of the country and in its future relationship with the US as well. This will, of course, tonight be the final time that all four candidates join each other on stage for members of the Liberal Party to be able to assess and view their platforms before they're asked to vote for a new leader on the 9th of March.
Thomas Lewis, thank you very much. This is The Briefing. And finally on today's show, Louis Vuitton is the latest global fashion brand to enter the growing market for Formula One, taking on a 10-year partnership that, among other things, will see it sponsor the Australian Grand Prix. It's all part of a growing interest in Formula One racing off the back of a Netflix series and the increasing number of female fans that's changing the nature of the sport and drawing the interest of fashion companies. Well, Samantha Tsay is fashion and design journalist. She joins us now. Samantha, what's happening here? Why all the interest from fashion companies?
Well, it's really interesting to see the rise of not just F1, but sports and its partnership with fashion, but in particular with F1. I definitely think, F1 in general has had a long history with Hollywood. It's always been sort of, glitzy, very aspirational, very glamorous. And I think now, especially with the Netflix series, it's definitely opened up a new category of people to market to. Women have taken a deep interest in it. And F1 has become very much an aspirational sport, much more than before. It's had a lot of visibility with women, and I think that's definitely something that the brands have got their eyes on.
Tell me more about that shift, because as you say, F1 has always had a luxury aspect, a glamour aspect to it. But is the reason that fashion companies are catching on now because this sort of demographic has changed and the way that it's seen has changed, the following has changed?
Definitely. I mean, I think so. I've seen the sponsorship between brands and teams have definitely skyrocketed as they both try to tap into the zeitgeist. Of course, Formula One, like I said before, has always been synonymous with luxury. It's a sport for the rich. It's got six-figure entry costs. It's got, really, when you think about, for example, the Miami Grand Prix, packages start from $700 to easily $10,000. And when you think about who's sitting out there and their spending power and their visibility, in addition to all, you have Hollywood, you have music, you have influencers, you have obviously people from fashion and models and whatnot, all being sat there. It's a really great combination of, of everything that fashion is all about. It's about, of course, the glitz and the glamour. It's also about the craftsmanship and dedication, which is all the things that F1 is also a big part of as well. You can't have a good race without a meticulously crafted vehicle, for example, So I definitely think that there's the visibility, which is huge right now. The Netflix series was really quite an eye-opener. I think a lot of people didn't really understand the sport before, and all of a sudden it is even sexier. It's more out there. I mean, there are, I believe, 23 Grand Prix races throughout the year. So that's more than Fashion Week, the Super Bowl, and, the Academy Awards all put together. It's a great opportunity for visibility for both the brand and the sport.
And Samantha, is there a flip side to this? I mean, will investment in sport from these fashion brands change the way that they operate themselves? What kind of offerings they have when it comes to their own fashions?
I definitely think so. I mean, you have sports tropes, which have always been a part of, fashion collections. You'll see that at least one designer will draw on a sports trope at least, once a season. But now I think there's an allocation to merch, for example, branded merch. There's also an allocation of funds and their ambassadors to these particular events. So I think brand strategy has changed as well, because this is a whole new category for some brands. And it's not just in the luxury sphere. This is actually going on across the retail. You definitely see it on the high street level as well, with Abercrombie and Fitch, as well as Reiss, which have both done collaborations with McLaren's. So, you definitely see it across the board, which is really interesting to see. So, of course, yes, Vuitton has signed a 10-year deal with F1. And what that is amazing is that not only is their name out there, but, you're going to be seeing them, they've designed a beautiful trunk for the trophy. But not everyone has the spending power to be able to go to a Vuitton store and pick up merch. So then, I think it's also interesting to see that this is actually, Abercrombie and Fitch, they had a really great collaboration with McLaren's, like I said, Reese did as well. And both of them have gone, have really increased their strategy because of that. If I remember correctly, with Abercrombie and Fitch, they launched a sweepstake getaway with McLaren on TikTok as part of an ongoing partnership. And one of the giveaways was tickets to the 2024 Miami Grand Prix, including hotel and airfare. And of course, that was huge, and I believe that their social imprint increased over 4,000% since the partnership. So that's really huge, isn't it?
Broadening out the interest there. That was the fashion and design journalist Samantha Say. Thank you very much for joining us. That's all the time we have for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Hassan Anderson. Our researcher was Maisie Ringer, and our studio manager was Alan Whedon. The Briefing is back tomorrow at the same time. I'm Chris Chermak. Goodbye, and thanks for listening.